Hello students, in this video we will be talking about thermodynamics, which is the study of energy, and specifically look at bioenergetics, which is talking about how energy flows in living systems. Before we get too far into this though, we must define what energy actually is. So energy, simply put, is the capacity to do work. Energy can come in two major forms. There's potential energy, which is stored energy. That's much like having a ball at the top of a hill. It has a lot of stored energy that can do work, has the potential to do work, but it's not actively doing work at the time. The other type of energy is kinetic energy, or energy of motion. So if you were to give that ball a little bit of a push, this kinetic energy then would, or the potential energy would be getting converted to kinetic energy, which would allow the hill to move, or the ball to move down the hill and release that energy. Now, energy does come in more forms than just this simple motion. So energy can come in the form of heat, chemical energy, energy of motion, radiation energy, the electricity that's associated with an electrical current. All of these types of electricity can actually be interconverted, and because of that you can actually use the same units to describe them. So you do have different units to describe different amounts of energy depending on what it is, but in biology we're typically going to describe energy in the form of calories or joules. Now we do this because heat energy, that's what calories and joules measure, is just a very convenient way of measuring energy, because ultimately all energy can be converted into heat. Now, in biological systems, one of the major ways that we are going to be concerned with electricity is actually chemical energy and the energy that happens in chemical reactions. Now, bonds are going to be able to take in energy when they're formed and release energy when they're broken. And if you have a reaction that needs more energy than what the system can provide, you need to take in energy in some different way. For example, photosynthesis, we're going to be taking in solar energy to form the chemical bonds that are made with glucose molecules. Now, major reactions that we see in biology include redox reactions. So redox stands for reduction and oxidation. A reduction reaction is one in which electrons are gained. So you have something that is actually gaining an electron, and this in turn reduces it. This may seem kind of counterintuitive because you are gaining an electron yet being reduced. The way that I've always thought of it as is that you are reducing the overall charge on a molecule. So electrons are negatively charged. If you're gaining an electron, that means you're gaining a negative charge and you're reducing the charge on that molecule. Now, oxidation is the inverse of this. This is actually losing an electron. So something that is oxidized actually gives away an electron. Now, in biology, we're not going to just see something gaining an electron or losing an electron. It's always going to happen combined. There's always going to be something, or typically always going to be something that is donating the electron and something that is accepting the electron. One of the major things, or major molecules that we see with redox reactions is NAD plus and NADH. So NAD plus over here on the left, it can actually accept electrons, and when it accepts it, it becomes reduced to NADH. This molecule can then move around in the cell and eventually give these electrons to another molecule, and when it does that, it gets oxidized back into NAD plus. And so NAD plus and NADH can essentially be thought of as a taxi that's carrying around electrons and giving them to other molecules. So it can be taking it from glucose and giving it to something else that's going to help the cell do work. This brings us to the first and second law of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics simply states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change from one form to the other. This means that there is a finite amount of energy in the universe, and this energy can only change form from one thing to another. For biological systems, this means that we have to obtain our energy from other things. So plants, they can actually capture solar energy, so they're taking energy from the sun and using this energy to make build the chemical bonds of glucose and other organic molecules. As animals, we actually have to take our energy from other living things. So this lion, for example, it's getting its chemical energy from an antelope or something that it just ran down. And so it's converting its chemical energy into different types of energy for the lion to eventually use it to roar, run down other things, digest its food, etc. Now, this conversion of energy from one form to another is never going to be 100% efficient. We always have some of the energy being lost as heat. For cellular systems and biological systems, heat is really not going to be usable energy. Heat is only usable to do work when there's a gradient, and cells are too small for a gradient in heat energy to really be established. So when we convert convert energy, so when you take the plant glucose and convert it into energy to make ATP, you're not going to take all the energy from the glucose and make ATP with it. Some of that energy is going to be lost as heat, so it's not a 100% efficient process. Now, the second law of thermodynamics has to deal with entropy. So entropy is a measure of disorder, and the second law states that the total entropy can only increase over time for an isolated system. An isolated system being a system which neither energy nor matter can enter or leave. What this means is that you can have something very ordered. It's over time spontaneously going to become more disordered. So this represents a more disordered system. This happens just because disorder is more likely than order. So it's sort of a probability thing that's going to drive this. But essentially what happens is that unless you put energy into it to reorganize it, everything's going to become more and more disordered. For example, you may have a dorm. You probably live in the dorm here on campus, and if you don't put an effort into keeping it clean, it's going to spontaneously become more messy. You're going to start having a bed that's not made, clothes on the floor, maybe plates lying around everywhere, and you actually have to put energy in then to overcome the disorder. So entropy can be overcome, but you have to put energy into the system. So here on Earth, we have solar energy that ultimately is going to power most biological systems. Now, all of this can actually be measured, and we use something called free energy as a measure of the energy available in a system to do work. So free energy is essentially the energy to break and form other chemical bonds. We denote free energy as G here, and we can relate the change in free energy to a change in enthalpy, which is delta H minus temperature times delta S, so the change in entropy. So enthalpy is the energy of a chemical bond, and T is temperature, delta S then is the amount of disorder. So you can imagine a system where you have increase in disorder. If you have increase in disorder, there's going to be more free energy released. Also, if you have a system which is going to release energy from chemical bonds, this is going to lead to more delta energy being free. So let's look at delta G in the context of some energy diagrams. So there's two types of chemical reactions. There are endergonic reactions, where energy actually has to be put into the system, and there's exergonic reactions, which release energy. So if we look at these diagrams, the course of the reaction runs here on the x-axis, the free energy is over here on the y-axis. So you start off with reactants and you form products. Now for an endergonic reaction, the reactants are going to be at a lower energy than the products are. So that means that energy is going to be absorbed. You're going to have a positive delta G for endergonic reactions. That means that you actually have to put energy into the system in order to get it to work. For the forming of glucose, for example, would be a endergonic reaction that you have to put energy in. Now this energy is going to come from the solar energy that we capture via photosynthesis. Exergonic reactions, on the other hand, release energy. So you're going to have a negative delta G in this case, with the reactants starting at a higher energy than the products. Breaking down glucose, for example, is going to release energy. So if you break down glucose to carbon dioxide and water, what's going to be formed is, or what's going to be released is going to be usable energy that the cell can use to run other reactions. Now you can actually combine endergonic and the exergonic reactions. So if you have an exergonic reaction that releases energy, this energy that's released can actually be captured and used to power endergonic reactions. For example, making ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphates is an endergonic reaction, but we couple that to the exergonic reaction of glucose oxidation, which is going to actually allow us to make ATP, even though it's an energetically unfavorable reaction. Now, all exergonic reactions are said to be spontaneous, which means that given time, they will occur on their own. So reactants tend to want to go down. So this is the free energy could be thought of as potential energy, but it wants to be released, and maybe that heat could be that energy could be lost as heat. So it's naturally going to go down this hill. So it's going to happen spontaneously. That means without the input of additional energy. Notice that this does not mean that the reaction is going to occur instantaneously. The reasons all spontaneous reactions don't occur instantaneously is because a certain amount of activation energy may be necessary. And in biological systems, we're going to see activation energy play an important role. So if we look at an energy diagram, this is an endergonic reaction, but the activation energy is going to be this little hump that we have to get over to go from the reactants to the product side of the reaction. So you have to go all the way up here and get your molecules to this level of energy before they would have enough energy to start going down and forming the product. So you'd form an intermediate or a transient state of the molecule. Now, there are ways of lowering the activation energy, namely using catalysts. So a catalyst isn't going to drive a reaction forward or in the reverse reaction, but it does allow the reaction to occur faster because you add the catalyst which catalyzes the reaction. It lowers the activation energy. So catalysts work by lowering this activation energy so that you don't have to get it to as high of energy in order for the reaction to occur. This means that it's easier to get more molecules into this state and to actually get the reaction going forward. But once equilibrium's been established, it's not going to favor the reaction one way or the other. It simply makes it so that the molecules can reach equilibrium faster. So it's going to lower the activation for the reverse reaction as well. So you're not shifting equilibrium with the catalyst, but you are lowering the activation energy so that the reaction can react faster. So activation energy has to do with how fast the reaction will occur. So you can think of in your car, you have a bunch of gas in there. Now this gas has it's actually going to be an exergonic reaction, igniting the fuel so that you produce the products. But you'll notice that in your car, it just doesn't instantaneously shift into, or you don't instantaneously break down the molecules. You have to put some of this energy in, this activation energy, in order to drive the reaction forward. So, starting your car with the ignition, so you start burning the fuel and actually driving it forward. And that's the idea behind activation energy, is this initial energy that you need to put into it in order to get over this hump and drive the reaction forward. Now we've talked about ATP before. ATP is going to be the energy currency of the cell. So you can think of this as more of the short-term cash on hand that you would have in order to pay for reactions to occur. So ATP, this is an ATP molecule here. You may recognize it as sort of a derivative of a nucleotide. So if you would just take a phosphate, sugar, and nitrogenous base, you'd have a nucleotide. This nucleotide, however, has 2 additional phosphate groups attached to it. And these additional phosphate groups, typically these H's are going to be missing from them, and they're actually going to be negatively charged. And so you're putting together a bunch of negatively charged things. It's like pushing in a spring. So these contain a lot of potential energy for work to occur. Now it does have a decent amount of activation energy, so it, that you need to actually break in order for the reaction to go forward. But once that reaction breaks and you remove one of them, so down here is ADP, meaning that you've removed a phosphate from it, you've released energy. This energy can be then used in the cell to produce more, to do some sort of work, to contract muscles, move molecules against their concentration gradient, or what have you. Now, we will need to put more energy into the system, so we'll have to add energy from in some form or another to take this ATP and form it back, ADP and form it back into ATP. And that's really going to be the topic that we delve into next, how we actually get energy from it, which namely is going to be via cellular respiration. All right, I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you guys in class.